We hear the word populism everywhere, from political debates to Instagram reels. But what does it actually mean? And why are so many leaders calling themselves for the people when they're living lives that couldn't be further removed from them? Today, we're unpacking what populism really means and exploring how it's been co opted by both sides of the political spectrum, and also what it means to truly represent the people. You're listening to Fed Up and Figuring It Out, unpacking politics, culture, and global power. If you ever thought, why does this all feel like bullshit? You're in the right place. I'm your host, Pri Mignot. As always, everything cited throughout this episode will be in this episode's description. Before we can talk about why populism matters today, we have to understand what it's supposed to mean and what it's become. Because if you're anything like me, I actually didn't know what populism meant until 2 years ago. And the more and more I learned about it, like they're talking about populist leaders in a political science university I was attending in France. And I was like, I don't know what this means. And then the more I looked into it, the more I'm like, oh, we have populist leaders across the globe. And I think it's an important word to know. And similar to like the episode we did on fascism, I think it's a big concept word that's being thrown around a lot, and I feel like we need a more refined definition of what we're talking about. So, populism at its core means a person who represents the ordinary people against the elites or the establishment. So, not that they are necessarily anti-establishment, but they are supposed to be for the average Joe kind of idea. A leader or an elected official who is representing the average Joe and saying that they are part of that average collection of people. And so, although it sometimes is difficult to define, uh, sometimes there's different variations, and everyone's, I think, has a little bit of a different variation sometimes when talking about populism. At its core, it means a leader who talks on behalf of the ordinary people who have in some way been let down by the elite establishment. And when I say elite establishment, it can be anything. And it's kind of like people who've been let down by certain institutions or their governments, or have become disenfranchised for different reasons. Uh, and that they are supposed to represent the average person against these establishments. But again, because it's very broad who the ordinary person is, and it's very broad what the elite, quote unquote, elite establishment is, that's why there's so many kind of variations in this definition, but the general overarching idea is that. Populism is largely considered a right-wing ideology, but it also has roots in the left as well. And that also is because populism kind of shifts depending on who's using it. A lot of populism now is performative populism. And it's people who don't actually represent the people and they're not interested in representing the average person. They don't know what the average person goes through. But they are still claiming that they are for the people, by the people, all that kind of stuff. And there are people who are actually for the people who have gone into politics or become leaders because of the needs they've seen in their community, and then they enact policy change because of those things. So that is typically why it differs slightly. And you can have good populist leaders on the right. It typically, I think, um, it's more co-opted as a term by the right, and it's because it's like fake populism in some ways, or a person is faking to be a populist and not actually for the people. Or they might be for the people, but they don't have any clue what the average person is like. So that's kind of a more of a right thing. But there's also the left side of that where people are like, I'm for the people, and it's like, you are also super disconnected. You have no idea what you're talking about. So yeah, it's kind of both sides of the political spectrum. Let's just say that. A lot of times when someone says they're a populist, and most people won't say they're populist, they'll say they're for the people or for the average working person. A lot of the time, they're selling the aesthetic of populism without the substance of it. They're not going to enact changes in the government level and in high levels to help the average person. They're just saying that so they get elected and have power. And a lot of times people, again, like want people to care about them. So when they're like, this person is going to represent me at the higher levels in government or in a community or in a board or whatever the case is, it's a natural thing to want to vote for them because they're like, oh, they're saying they're for us. But at the same time, a lot of those people who are elected don't have the substance behind them to actually, once they get into that position of power, hold down and say that they are for the community and stay in that community and stay working for that community. And that's because, again, like a lot of people will say they're for the people because that sells, that gets them into the positions of power they need to be in, that they're going for. And so, kind of regardless of ideology, whether you're right or left, it does, this idea behind populism sells because people want to be represented. People want to feel like they're seen, and that is like there's a lot of psychology behind populism, but yeah, generally that is why that happens. So in recent years, at least in my degrees, I'm not in a political science degree, but I am in a global development degree and a communications degree and an international indigenous studies degree. Pretty well rounded, and I've actually had a couple poly classes before, poli-sci classes. And I was fortunate enough to study at Sciences Po in France for a semester, and so that's a political science university in France. And maybe it's just my circles, but to me, and I think just in general in the university world at least, the term populism is becoming more and more of a buzzword, and you're hearing it more and more. But again, the terminology is rarely consistent because who the ordinary person is and who the elite establishment is varies. And a lot of political scientists are now calling this populism a buzzword because it's everywhere, but it means almost nothing unless you look at who's saying it and why they're saying it. Like, it doesn't, again, like, because there's so many people who pretend to be populist, it's like, are you actually a populist, or are you just using the word populist? And so there's like a big overarching branch of what populism actually means as a result of that, because even the people who are fake populists are still considered populists, and the people who are genuinely populist, there's a lot of populist coming out of my mouth, are actually populist. So then that's a very big range. And so I think that's what they mean by buzzword. It's becoming more and more popularized. And this term has existed since the Roman times. So it's been used in our vocabulary and used to describe different leaders throughout most of human history. But right now it's on the rise in political science discussions and in discussions around governance and democracy. There are some challenges with populism though, and maybe if you've listened to the episode I have on fascism, which you should, there is quite a bit of echoing that comes between populism and fascism. So, for example, a lot of populist leaders will use less evidence-based facts in their rhetoric. Like when they're talking to people, they'll use less evidence, and they'll rely more on conspiracy theories as to why the world isn't the way that people want it to be. Why is the average person, and again, average is very generalized. We're going to talk more about that, but it can be anyone. Why is the average person being slighted out of housing or salary or different rights, and why is the world not the way these people, like all of us, were raised a certain way to think the world was going to be, and now that we're here, it's like, okay, the world's not that way, and that's because of a lot of factors and a lot of evidence and a lot of things, and the world was never going to be the exact way we all thought it was going to be growing up, and but a lot of populism relies on, again, conspiracy theories to validate, to be like, you don't have this because of this elite establishment. You don't have this because because the government's letting in too many immigrants. You don't have this because gender roles are not working anymore. Again, you can still be a populist leader, a true populist leader, and rely on conspiracy theories. But at the same time, it's a lack of leadership and a lack of accountability in some ways when you're like, you can't do this because of XYZ, and it's like a conspiracy theory. It's not like you can't afford housing, not because of immigrants, but because of policies in place, or because billionaires are buying up houses in your neighborhood, or because, like, all these different things that factor into it. And it's like, the thing they're trying to target is not the thing that actually is causing the problems for you as an individual. You know what I mean? And this kind of ties into how populism can lead to authoritarianism and fascism. Like, it's kind of again, like, it is weird because this is why populism gets confusing, is because you can have true populists who don't fall into authoritarianism and don't rely on conspiracy theories, and you can have populists who are also somewhat true, and also fake populists. Fake populists, I feel like, fall more into this, but there's also true populists who will fall into authoritarianism and use conspiracy theories. And so it is really a bit of a definition to wrap your mind around, but the idea is that they're for the people. In whatever way, if they're saying that to say it, or they actually represent that. In a new BBC article, they talk about how populism is on the rise across the globe, specifically across Europe and their right wing parties, and in the US, where it helped crown Trump. So, like Trump winning the election, Trump ran on the fact that he was for the people, for the average working person. So many rural working people voted for him. And it's like, I just think, oh my God, if you had looked at his tax policies, like what he was suggesting versus what Harris was suggesting at the time, it was so apparent who was more beneficial to the working people. And I'm not saying Kamala Harris necessarily knows what it's like to be grounded in like the common average American experience anymore, but neither does Trump. But because they're so wealthy, and that's, I mean, a different conversation. But at the same time, when you look at the financial things they were thinking about for tax brackets, it clearly shows that Kamala Harris was better for the average working American, for the average rural American, and Trump wasn't. Trump was going to get like the top 1% again richer. So it was just, it's very hard when those things happen because Trump obviously said he was for the people so many times and for the rural, and the rural community voted for him, and yet he hasn't supported them even in the slightest, like shutting down hospitals and removing educational funding, and like all that stuff hurts rural communities. In this BBC article, Dr. Moffitt says the political scientists have been catching on to this trend in the rise of populism for the last 25 to 30 years. So it's been an ongoing thing. But Dr. Moffitt also mentions that there has been an acceleration in how fast populist leaders are rising across the globe. And I would say, in my personal opinion, a bit of a side note, but I think a lot of that comes down to like, we're seeing a rise in authoritarianism, we're seeing a rise in fascism, we're seeing a rise in populism. And it's because people are so disenfranchised by the systems they've been told are going to support them. And that is capitalism and patriarchy and colonization and like all this kind of stuff. We were all sold this idea, like white picket fence, husband, kids, if you're a guy, wife, kids, whatever the case is. But we were sold this idea of like a stable home in the suburbs, a stable job, maybe occasionally a family vacation in the year, um, health care, like all this kind of stuff, and like time for your family, and like time to have that family, that perfect nuclear family. And I think a lot of us are like, that's, first off, we're coming to realize that that is not the case. Because I think a lot of people are like, okay, so I'm not getting what I was told I was going to get. That's not, I was sold this idea my entire childhood and growing up. I was like, oh, I'm going to get this. And now it's like, okay, that's not actually the case. And I'm not saying that those things should happen. It's just that people are like, okay, I was sold this lie. How do I feel better about it? And they don't create something new. So they're like, okay, let's vote for people who are going to give me that reality. What I'm trying to say is that basically all these things that are on the rise, I think, are largely because we are realizing that these systems that were promised to work for us are no longer working for us. And the average person maybe is not aware that that is directly the case that they are angry about. But the systems that are not working for them are the things that are leading to this person in a situation where they're not happy with the situation. So they're voting for populist leaders and authoritarian leaders and fascist leaders so that they can have some semblance of being like, okay, we're going to get back to what I thought I was going to get. And the truth is that these leaders will never give you that. I think all these systems that we were told don't work anymore, or they're not working because there's not enough like barriers in place to keep them in check. And this is what's happening. So here's the thing too, is that populism also bumps up against another powerful idea called meritocracy, which is the belief that success should come from talent, education, and effort rather than birth or privilege. And so a lot of you would argue that merit is essential, and I would also agree to some degree that merit is important. You want leaders who understand complex systems like the economy, diplomacy, healthcare, people who have earned their way to the top through skill. And that is really important because you need leaders who are skillful. And I think, especially under populism, we aren't electing leaders who are skillful necessarily. But done right, meritocracy puts the best and most deserving people into positions of power and influence. It can convey a sense of fairness and maybe even return like a sense of respect to authority. But the problem is if you value merit, you risk creating a government full of people who are brilliant but completely disconnected from real life and have no concept of what it's like to be the average person. So on paper, meritocracy sounds fair, but in practice, it also often hides inequality. Not everyone has the same access to opportunities. And that is kind of where things get really complicated because that, again, that ties into like the elite establishment. A lot of people would argue that meritocracy is elitist, that not everyone can have access to the best education, the best networks, the best like systems to grow and develop those skills in. And so then does that mean that the average person can't become a leader? And that's not true either. So, and that is the challenge, is that privilege often disguises itself as merit. So there is an aspect of meritocracy that's important, like having people who are skillful, having people who are knowledgeable in government. But at the same time, they have to be connected to the communities and the constituents that they represent. We can see this even like in some cases that elite establishments, and I'm using that very loosely, but elite establishments will often use merit to explain, justify, and make sense of advantage positions. Like they're here because they went to Harvard, or they're here because they went to U of T, or whatever the case is, and I mean UFC or whatever it is, but all of these things. And they're like, they're in this position because of this. And it's like, well, take into account, like, did they have the funding to go to secondary education? Do they have the people skills, the networking skills, like, or did they just get pushed there because they could afford it? And so for me, the answer for a good leader lies somewhere in between. The merit matters, like having someone who's knowledgeable about certain systems, but character matters more. A critical element of reforming meritocracy is adopting and applying a robust and expansive definition of merit that goes beyond job capabilities and perceived effort to include character traits such as integrity, humility, selfless ambition, resilience, kindness, empathy, and respect for others. Here's the challenge, is that a degree or a job title might teach you how to think, but character determines what you do with that thinking. And like leadership without integrity is just a management of power. They aren't actually leaders. So if you lack integrity and you lack the characteristics that make a good leader, then you're not going to be a good leader. You're just going to try to keep power and hold it and do whatever you can to manage that. And that is the thing about populism. True populism is about character, not merit. And so again, like I agree that character matters more than merit. I think you need good people to lead in many ways, but I also think merit has a place in that, like having an education in the economy or having an education in anything, or it doesn't even have to be an education, but having a certain level of experience in a field. It kind of is a mix of experience, education, and like networking ability, like who you are friends with, who you can talk to, the kind of community you build with that information. And again, like, yeah, populism is about character. It's about being integrity. It's about the integrity. It's about representing the average person. It's about compassion. It's about kindness. And it's not about merit necessarily. So in theory, at least, populism pushes back against meritocracy. It says leadership isn't about degrees or resumes. It's about connection and representation. The struggle is that more often than not, the people who preach being for the people could not be further from them. And they don't actually have the characteristics to back it up. They don't necessarily have merit, and they don't actually have characteristics to back it up. So it's just a bit of a clusterfuck. But there's two case studies we can look at to see this like opposing contrast. Is Vladimir Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine, who was a former comedian and turned wartime hero or leader. He's a model of character over traditional merit. He didn't like rise to power because of his political affiliations. Before politics, he was literally a comedian on television, and he had no prestigious political background, no decades of experience, but he was elected anyway. He was elected running for the people, and you know, people can say that as much as they want and then get into office and not represent the average person, but Zelensky did. He came into office, and then when war hit Ukraine, he didn't flee, but he stayed, and he stayed to help support his country. And he showed courage, empathy, and humility. And those are qualities that like no diploma or experience can give you. That's character, and you have to have that inherently in you. So Zelensky is kind of a populist leader in one way. The contrast, which I'm sure you can predict who's going to be, is Donald Trump. And Donald is a character who is a populist leader who ran on business merit. He was a successful entrepreneur who wanted to run the country like a company and support the average American. His business experience did not equal a moral compass, and we could have already predicted that based on his businesses and based on his entire experience leading up to that he doesn't have character, he doesn't have integrity. Um and so the result was predictable. There is chaos and division, and like his whole movement is built on outrage and conspiracy theories and not on the service and not on the uplifting of the everyday American. So if people had prioritized his character over his resume in some ways, like his idea that had merit, or if they had prioritized his character and looked at his character over what was coming out of his mouth, none of this would have been surprising. Like none of this would have been surprising. The question then becomes, when you're saying you're a populist leader, who are the people you are actually representing? And so there's the term cultural populism, which claims that the true people are the native members of a nation state. And so the person typically, especially in farther right discussions, populism, saying you're for the average person, typically means you're for a person who is born and raised in the nation state that you are representing and is not a minority. So the outside, so the people who you're not really representing when you're a populist leader, is immigrants, anyone who's a criminal, ethnic and religious minorities, elites, like all these different things. So there's a very specific idea of what it means when someone says they are, like a populist leader says they're for the people. And that's not true for every populist leader, but it is often very true for right-wing populist leaders who are also not real populist leaders. They say they're for the people, but they're like, when I'm for the people, I'm for this very specific idea of like a rural white farmer. um, and that's like, okay, but there's 1,000 different variations of people in a country. And so how you saying you're for the people is like really weird in some ways, because it's good and bad. Like if you're genuinely for the people and you're trying to represent and uplift people and ensure that there's social security for people and social safety nets and all this kind of stuff and uplift your community that you're representing, all the power to you. Great, then you are for the people. But there's a lot of people who are like, I'm for the people, and it's like I'm trying to appeal to this one specific group of people. But even then, I'm not going to represent them properly. And even if you do represent them properly, you're still missing 80% of everyone else. Like it's just weird in that way. And that is the trick with populism, is that while people might claim it's about character and connection, the people often using the word typically embody neither. What is the deal with populist leaders? Are they then heroes of democracy representing the average person, and by average person the people they are representing as constituents? Or are they just master marketers trying to get power? This is the tricky part again, is that populist leaders who are the master marketer kind of types are not actually for the people. They might claim they are, but they're not. And they're usually a part of the very elite that they claim to fight. So, I don't know, for like, you could even talk about like, again, like Donald. Like he's a billionaire. It's like, it's so freaking far disconnected from the average American that it's like, how, it's just weird. Like, it's like, we're against like, elite establishments, and it's like, okay, but the person you're voting for is like, they can be a part of that elite establishment, I think, in some ways, and be still for you, but at the same time, it's like, if you had just looked at his character and looked at everything he's ever done and everything he said he was gonna do, you knew he wasn't the average working person. You knew he was just trying to support like his elite friends. And so it's just really weird in that way too, where people don't look at who they're voting for, which drives me a little up the wall, or they vote for based on party. And like I understand voting a party in some regard, but vote for the better leader. Vote for the person with more character. Vote for the person with more integrity, who you think will actually represent you. Yeah, I think like the idea that someone is like, I don't even need to look at who I'm voting for, I just know what party I'm voting for. I'm like, that is psychotic. Like, pick a person who you know has character and integrity, and they'll hold up in like whatever house they need to hold up in, or like system or government they need to hold up in. Because often when people say they're for the people and like the populist idea, these people have no idea what groceries cost necessarily. They've never sat for hours in the emergency room. They don't understand how bad the healthcare system is in a lot of places. They've never had to worry about affording rent or daycare, and yet they often position themselves as one of us. And that's the thing, is that populist leaders often promise prosperity and dignity for the poor, the unseen, and the left behind, and those disengaged with ideas of meritocracy. But they also don't walk the pro-poor policy walk. Like, they won't pass things that actually support the underprivileged. Populism has been more and more co-opted by the right, and there's an article that came out by York University that talks about, although populism as a thin ideology can be either left or right wing, the term is most often encountered alongside the discussion of right wing populism. And so, again, in this right wing idea, according to this York article, and as we've talked about, when you're a right wing populist, there typically is this idea of the other. So there's the average person you're representing, the people you're representing, and the other you're not representing. And that is like minorities or the elite or whatever the case is. So typically, and then that ties into conspiracy theories. And so for the right wing populists, it often is just a scapegoating technique to say you're for the person, but these aren't the people. The people you're not representing are not the people. And then that's a whole thing too, according to this article and according to what we talked about earlier. And this idea of the other changes across time and space, but they always almost belong to the oppressed, exploited, marginalized, and or politically counter-hegemonic groups. So just people who are different in some ways, and being different, a political counter-hegemonic group means like if you're talking to a Republican or like a whatever, like let's say Republican populist, they're like, okay, the Democrats are not who I'm representing. They're not my people. And it's like, that is such a, and this is the thing too, is I don't know what Kamala Harris would have been like as president, but I did listen to her book, 107 Days, and she really does, throughout the whole 7 days, 107 days, and the chapter she writes, she talks about how she was there for every American. And she's like, it doesn't matter if you vote for me or not, I'm there to represent you. And what a counter difference to what Trump would do. Like, Trump is like anti-Democrat all the way. And it's like, no, you are now representing everyone in this country. Like, that's also the weird thing, is it's like you have to be willing to represent every person. Not just who voted for you, not just who you promised to like support. It's like you are now in charge. Not in charge, but you are now holding the vote for all these people, and you have an obligation to represent them as best as possible and support them as best as possible. Again, this far right populism, often it's talking about exclusionary nationalism and cultural conservatism, and it ties into like protecting the people and protecting tradition, which like fuels into culture wars, and it adds to conspiracy theories. There's examples of this as attacking wokeism, vilifying migrants, blaming the marginalized. And so the most successful populists today are on the right, and particularly the far right. So that is also a challenge, that when you're like, okay, populism as an idea at its core makes a lot of sense, and it's a great idea for people to be for the people and representing the people. But when it's been so co-opted and so taken out of context and so like tarnished, then how do you deal with that as well? Is populism always fake is now the question, like in our modern day world? Or are there leaders who genuinely rise from the people and are for the people? For me, there is two examples that stand out right now, and I know that American politics is very widely talked about, so it's kind of the one I zone in on the most, and that's not meant to be rude to Americans, but their news is everywhere. And so the two I kind of want to talk about in the States specifically are Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I think she is such a great example of populism in many ways, like true populism. And that is because like I watched her documentary on Netflix. Well, documentary's in on Netflix, and it talks about how she's a working class person. I think she was a bartender and like doing all this kind of stuff, and she realized that the person who was running for her constituency her like area was not representing the people properly in the Bronx, New York. And she's like, they're not representing the average day American. They're not representing us. And they're running like almost unopposed. And so Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was like, okay, I may not have the credentials necessarily to be a political science or be a politician, but I'm gonna run because someone needs to stand up for everyday people. And she did, and she won. And she is now been in politics for a long time. And she is, I think, a really good example of sticking to your word and having that integrity. Like, she calls out bullshit on the floor when things are not making sense. Like, because people are protecting, like, the ultra rich or protecting predators or whatever the case is. She calls it out. She's like, this is horseshit. Like, what are we doing? And I think a lot of politicians at that point would back off because they're like, I already have the position of power. I don't want to risk it. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez doesn't do that. And she really advocates for the working class issues. So I think she's a really great example of that. And like even a more recent example is Zohran Mamdani, the mayor of New York City, and who was a community organizer turned political leader. And he was elected pretty recently on like a socialist democratic platform and saying he was going to be for New Yorkers and like represent New Yorkers and protect New Yorkers from the government, from big companies, all this kind of stuff. And I mean, it's pretty new, so I mean, you never know. But starting out so far, he has stuck to his word. He's had that integrity. He's passed laws to support New Yorkers. He's gone after like Amazon for paying fines on trucks that they haven't paid fines on. Like they owed $9 million in fines or something like that to the New York government, the New York City, and they weren't paying it. And Zoran now is like, "You're gonna pay it. Like you owe the New York residents that money." And so I think that is also like sticking to your guns and having this empathy and compassion. And I think we've seen that in some of his stuff he's done as well, like with just community engagement. So these are leaders that aren't perfect. And again, they'll make mistakes. They might not represent every person in the community, but they come from realities that they talk about and they've lived in the systems they're trying to reform and trying to build. True populists typically emerge, like honest populists typically emerge from their communities, and fake ones perform community. They pretend that they're a part of it. And this is not to say that there is, again, there are left-leaning populists and left-wing populists that are not actually people-driven. They want power and they'll appeal to people based on like socialist policies and equality, but then they don't actually represent that. How can you tell a true populist from a like fake populist in many ways? And true populists often speak with the people and not for them. So they'll come to the community, they'll talk about what's going on, and they're like, okay. And sometimes you have to speak for a person because that's your job. But at the same time, it's like, okay, I'm going to listen to all these ideas and be like, okay, this is going forward, what I'm going to do. And I think we've seen a lot of that not happening with politics lately. And I think that's why a lot of people are very angry with governments and like disenfranchised by politicians. It's because they don't stick to their word or they don't have the integrity to hold up their communities that they're told they're going to represent. So it is this idea of like, I'm voting not for my self-interest, I'm voting for the people I'm representing and what they collectively want or the majority want. And so they often push for systemic change and not cultural distractions. So they don't start culture wars and shit. They are like, okay, let's pass these policies, let's get it going, let's move, because this is what we have to do to help our people. And not be like, I'm just gonna like push blame over there so I don't have to deal with it. Like that's not true populism, that's just horseshit. But oftentimes too, true populists live by the same realities as their constituents and not above them. And I think this is more challenging once you become elected. It's not always practical. Like, for example, the prime minister and the president, they can't live in the same realities that we do because they can't go to the grocery store. They're not allowed to go to like hospitals, to the emergency clinic. There's different things going on that they can't, like they have security 24/7. Their meals are cooked for them. Like, and there is not much you can do about that. Like, they're going to be like disconnected from the reality of most people because of those things. But at the same time, as long as they are staying true to their word and they are representing their constituents and doing the best they can to uphold their communities, I think there's a bit of a balance in there too, because You also can't like run for president of the United States without having millions and millions of dollars. Like it's expensive. And so then you're also disconnected economically from average Americans. And so, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't run, and that doesn't mean you won't be a great leader, I think. So it's a bit of a mix, I think, in some ways for that. And populist leaders also often accept criticism and adapt rather than weaponize outrage. Fake populists often use the us versus them rhetoric and protect elite interests. They actually protect the elite establishments that they are against, or supposedly against. They simplify complex issues into fear-based slogans. So like, they won't talk about the fact that you can't afford housing because of the economy and like all this other shit and the wars and whatever's going on. They're like, okay, it's this specific group of people that is why you can't afford a house. And it's like, you're just creating fear, and it's not true. So that's also part of fake populism. And they build loyalty through identity politics instead of policy. So instead of passing policy to build that kind of loyalty, being like, I am pro-farmer, so here's a pro-farmer bill. They're like, I'm going to say I'm pro-farmer because I wore a cowboy hat once, but I'm not going to pass anything that's like pro-farmer. And they often profit off the division that they sow. So the next time a politician says, I'm one of you, ask when was the last time they paid for their own groceries? And if they can't do that, when was the last time they had a family member struggle through healthcare? When was the last time they had a reality check on what the healthcare system is like in their countries or in their provinces or in their cities? Or did they put a bill through that actually supported community members and working people, or are they just saying that they support? And I think as soon as people, again, this requires critical thinking, which is, I think, a dying skill, but once you are like, okay, the person I want to vote for is this, and they're saying that for the people, let's just see what their history is. And their history is like everything that's not what you agree with and not for the people, and they're a bully, and they have no integrity and no character and no compassion, no empathy. It's like, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't vote for them. But I feel like people don't often look at the things that are actually happening behind the scenes versus what the person is just saying. I wish critical thinking wasn't a dying skill, but I fear it might be. Ask yourself these questions. Ask yourself, is this person actually for the people? Are they actually coming from community? And all this different stuff, and are they truly pushing for these things? Or are they just saying it to get elected and hold power? Because at its core, populism is supposed to sell hope and connection, but often it's used to sell anger and discontent. And again, like, we really got to hammer this home. Populism relies on the romantic idea of the people as a unified group. And I think representing the people, if you're a true populist, is really good because you're representing diverse opinions and diverse people, and you're aware of the diversity, you see it. Whereas a lot of time when people say they're representing the people, they're not representing everyone. So then the question is then, who actually belongs to the people? Who decides who counts as the people? And often in populist rhetoric, like if you're fake populist, the people rarely includes migrants, indigenous communities, queer people, or like anyone who challenges the status quo. So that's also like a big question. There is no singular people. There are communities, cultures, classes, and countless realities. And you have to be able to understand that when you're representing the people and being willing to represent everyone. True populism understands that representing the people can be messy. It can represent contradictions. But that's the thing about democracy. It was never meant to be straightforward. It's messy, it's plural, it's evolving, it's all of these different things that are not clean and straight, like clear cut. Real democracy isn't about following a populist voice. It's about participation, empathy, and demanding integrity from those who claim to represent us. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, take a minute to reflect. Who are the people that you see as for the people? And do their actions match their words? Feel free to share this video, leave a review, and keep the conversation going on Instagram. Sharing is caring, and it helps this podcast grow. I'll see you in the next episode.